are in Luke. We're in Luke 21, and you'll find Luke 21 to be one of those places in Scripture that can be a little challenging, and can be a little. There are a lot of questions that come up with it. Mike has put together a really nice. Am I hearing an echo?
Sorry, we're gonna. All right, let's keep going.
We good? No? Where's that coming from?
I did something. I'm sorry.
Let me see.
Okay, how about now?
Okay, we better?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're good. I think we're good now. Okay, sorry. A little technical difficulty there, but we got it. Our ace
Okay,
technical person got it squared away.
All the first place,
Luke 21 was going to be difficult enough without an echo throughout the whole thing. So Luke 21 is parallels are in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. Michael put together a really nice document that sort of shows us. I included it on your in your download. So if you haven't taken a look at that, you might. I should have put it up, and I forgot to. Anyway, he put together a pretty interesting parallel just to sort of let you see, the ways in which Luke is very close to Mark and Matthew, and also the ways in which he sort of, I think for very specific reasons probably, diverges a little bit. And we'll talk about some of those as we go. A couple of them are particularly interesting. But take a look at that. It's a really interesting way to sort of compare these accounts. We haven't really done a lot of comparing between gospels. I think there's value in that. I think there's also value in just sort of looking at a particular gospel writer's perspective, and that's kind of what we've been doing with Luke. But I do think it's worth kind of taking a look at some of those parallels, and you'll see some interesting things, and kind of help perhaps shed some light on what Luke is doing. Keep in mind what we have just looked at as we go into chapter 21, verse 5. A lot of times what happens when we get to verse 5 is we think suddenly everything is disconnected from what has just what we've just been talking about. It's not. It's connected. And Luke has some very specific interests and directions that he's going. If you look back at the previous material, you've got the parable of the minas, right? What should you be doing while you wait for the king? You've got then the entry to Jerusalem. Blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. And Luke there, again, diverges from Mark and Matthew by saying specifically the king. He's a king. You have then Jesus weeping over Jerusalem because they did not recognize the time of God's coming to them. And the same figure of speech that he uses in 21 about not leaving one stone on the other, this expression for total destruction. Then you have the cleansing of the temple. Jesus comes to the temple and brings the first brings judgment upon the temple for the choices they've made and the directions they've gone. Then, of course, predictably, there's a question about his authority. Who are you to say these things and do these things? And the loaded question about taxes. Right after the question about authority, though, there's the parable of the tenants. Their rejection of the Son and God's rejection of them. You have a dispute about resurrection and the age to come. You have the idea of the Messiah as David's son. The kingdom might not be what you think it is. It's just not just a continuation of Israel's glory days as seen in the family of David. It's something that's going to be something more than that, and different than that, and greater than that. And then you have, of course, the teachers of the law, the religious institution, contrasted with the widow who gives all that she has. And as Jesus is pointing that out, the disciples seem to be impressed with the wrong things. Have you noticed that? Verse 5, right after Jesus has talked about this widow giving all that she has, the disciples are remarking about the beauty of the temple and the value and the expensive stones and the way it's adorned. And that's leads Jesus then to say, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. You could take that a couple of ways, right? You could take that as a reference to the fact that everything we build eventually crumbles, right? Nothing lasts forever. Everything we build eventually falls apart. But they take it a little differently than that. They don't seem to take it in that general sense. They seem to take it more as being something more specific. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to take place? And that's what leads us then into the things Jesus says in the rest of this chapter. This question of the disciples, when will these things happen and what will be the sign that they're about to take place? So there's kind of two questions, right? They're related, but what are the two questions? Just so I can stop talking. What are the two questions?
When is it going to happen and how will we know?
When is it going to happen and how will we know? Yes. How will we know that we're there? We're to that point, right? And I don't think these are sort of academic questions for the disciples, right? I think these are questions that are urgent for them. How will we know that this is gonna happen, and what's the tip off? How will we be able to anticipate what's coming? And what do they think is coming? What do they think is coming to the? Okay, Michael actually included this file. That's good. We'll take a look at that in a minute. What they think is coming is what? What does Jesus say is coming? Let's be clear here. What has he told them is coming?
A new time period.
The destruction of Jerusalem. The destruction of the temple, particularly, right? And you should sort of extend that to Jerusalem. But yeah, specifically, he's told them what's coming is the destruction of Jerusalem. And they say, when and how will we know? If somebody told you Chicago was going to be destroyed in the near future, you'd want to know those two things, right? When and how do we know? Because you'd want to get out. you'd want to make yourself scarce. And so Jesus says, watch out that you're not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and the time is near. The time of what?
That's a challenging one.
That's a challenging one, isn't it?
Yeah, it could be the end of the period of the destruction, or the arrival of the kingdom, or it could be his coming.
And would those things for these guys be particularly distinguished one from the other? They might not be. I mean, this might be a situation where these things would sort of be the options you just mentioned would sort of be conflated together, right? But he says the time, they're going to say the time is near. And Jesus says, don't follow them. People are going to come say, things are bad, things are terrible, the time is near, the judgment is upon us, etc., etc. And Jesus says, don't follow them. And he says, when you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. So Jesus' first point is, you're going to hear about all kinds of bad things happen. Don't panic. don't freak out when you hear about these things. This is to be expected. He's saying this is what must happen. He said to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There'll be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events, and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they'll seize you and persecute They'll hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you'll be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. So you will bear testimony to me. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand about how you'll defend yourselves. For I'll give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You'll be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they'll put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm and you'll win life. Now let's pause a minute there. Wars and rumors of wars are coming, right? You're going to hear about all kinds of bad stuff. Not only are you going to hear about bad stuff, but what?
They've taken place.
What's that?
They've taken place already.
Okay. You're going to hear about these things taking place, but not only are you going to hear about bad things taking place, you're going to experience them. Bad things are going to happen to you too, right?
Right.
This is not going to be easy. And you're going to go through struggles, and you're going to go through turmoil, and you're going to go through sorrow. But again, Jesus reassures them, make up your mind. Don't worry beforehand about how you'll defend yourselves. I'll give you words. I'll help you. I'll be there with you. I'll walk through this with you, even when you're betrayed by those who are closest to you. It says in verse 16, they'll put some of you to death. He says in verse 18, not a hair of your head will perish. Which is it?
They'll possess or keep their soul.
Okay, yeah, I believe he's talking about the fact that there is a life that what they do to you can't touch, right? And that's the life that you're looking forward to, and that's the life you're putting your trust in and you're hoping. So some of you are going to be put to death, but as regards to that future age to come, not a hair of your heads will perish. You will have that life. You'll have that existence, that eternity. And so stand firm and you'll win life. It doesn't mean necessarily you're going to be vindicated in this life. It just means stand firm. And remember what Revelation talks about how if you'll be faithful, I'll give you a crown of life. That's the same promise.
We must have courage and hope.
Yes.
Firm in Jesus. So no matter how difficult life gets, we just put our faith and hope in him.
We can so easily get overwhelmed, can't we, by all the stuff going on around us and in our lives. We can so easily get lost in that we lose our hope and that we lose our perspective. And that's one of the things I think Jesus is wanting his disciples to guard against. Because, you know, when you're all about reacting to what's going on around you, it's, you know, you're kind of swinging back and forth, and you're ecstatic when things go well, and you're devastated when things go badly, and you know, you hear the news and you just think, man, the world's coming apart at the seams, and there's nothing we can do, and oh, you know, poor me, and you can very easily get just snowed under by all of that. And so I think that's a really good point, Linda. How did you say it again? We need to
Have courage and hope.
Yeah.
Difficult life gets, we just stand firm in Jesus.
Yes. Stand firm. And so he's talking about bearing testimony, right? He's talking about when people are persecuting you and you know, handing you over to the synagogues and putting you in prison, when they're doing all these things to you because of my name, he says, if you'll stand firm, if you'll keep on testifying and keep holding on to your identity and your trust and keep speaking my name, there's life in that. There's hope in that.
Absolutely.
So, other thoughts on that? All right. I mean, either you checked out already, or we're doing decent jobs. All right, verse 20. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. Josh, did you see that document that Michael just shared with us? Yeah. Pop that up on screen there, if you will. Yeah.
Which,
So in verse 20, he says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. Josh, if you would go to verse 20 on that document. I want you to see something that I think is pretty interesting. Actually, this is.
you want the multi-view.
Yeah, this is
That's
not
the
same.
earlier one that the earlier one.
I'm sorry.
You
this
had
is-
it. I can
I-
upload it again. I can upload it.
You know,
I can go, are you signing the email?
no, that's okay. Michael will upload it again. I'm sorry, Michael. If you do that, that'd be great.
All right.
You can just come
Yeah,
off.
send it in the chat, I'll put it.
Yeah, you can just come off that. So verse 20, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, now you're gonna see in a minute that Matthew and Mark both refer to something else. They refer to an Old Testament phrase, the abomination that causes desolation. I don't know if anybody has heard about that, is familiar with that. You can look back in Daniel if you want to get some background on that. In Daniel, it seems to be a reference to probably the desecration of the temple by a pagan altar. And here comes the document.
It's word.
And an abomination that either causes the desolation of the temple or causes desolation. And it's a little unclear, but it's a specific event in the history of Israel in which the temple was desecrated. Jesus takes that and applies it to the situation that is coming with Jerusalem. But in Luke, he doesn't use abomination of desolation. Maybe because Luke is more aimed at Gentiles, Greek speakers, non-Jews. That's perhaps one reason. Maybe just
Next
wants to-
page.
I believe it's verse 20, Josh. If you just scroll down. Yeah, Luke, so the far right column, verse 20.
There we go. That's the page.
Hey. Right there. So you see in verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, Mark 13:14, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. In Matthew 24, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. It seems like what's happening is Jesus is taking this event from
Daniel
history of
9.
Israel and says it's being more completely fulfilled, ultimately fulfilled in what's about to happen in Jerusalem. Luke just doesn't go there. Luke just says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Remember, the disciples asked what 2 questions?
When?
When?
How?
And how will we know, right? And so Jesus is responding actually to both those things, right? When, well, how will we know for sure? And the way it's going to happen seemingly is by these armies that are coming.
The question in Matthew is just a little different. When will these things come and what will be the sign of your coming?
Of your coming, right? Exactly. It's a little bit different, and Luke, and with Luke, it seems like at the beginning, at least, it's more geared toward the questions of the immediate destruction of the temple.
The word there, the word that is used in Matthew is parousia, which is
Yeah.
okay. But be careful, because sometimes there's another word for coming, erkomai, which is a verb. And erkomai can go back and forth between just like a coming or metaphor, but parousia is definitely his appearance.
Yeah, parousia comes from the visitation of the king or the emperor to a city. It was sort of a technical term by Jesus' day that talked about that specific thing. So yeah, it was a pretty good figure for that. But in verse 20, Jesus is saying, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded, you'll know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. It's debatable. There are some stories about believers who who believe what Jesus said. And in AD 70, when Rome, or 69 or 68, whenever they got there, and started besieging Jerusalem, they believed Jesus and they left and went to the mountains. Some debate about whether that's a genuine story or not, but it's a good story anyway. and you got to think that maybe somebody paid attention to what Jesus said here and chose not to be in Jerusalem when these things happen.
In Jewish culture, abomination, Gentile armies could be called abomination. Okay, and the desolation, obviously, destruction, emptiness. So, and in Daniel, it took me a while to work through Daniel, and I still probably have a little more work to do on that passage, but Luke pretty much agrees with what Daniel had to say. Okay, even though it's the abomination of desolation, but Daniel says in verse 27, he says, upon the wing, and they have to insert temple. What they mean is upon the wing of the temple, abominations. And he who comes, he will come cause desolations to a certain period of time, just to sum it up. But anyways, the wing of the temple, I took a look at the word. It took me some time scratching my head, looking at some dictionaries. Okay. It means extremity. It means extremity vertically or extremely horizontal. So therefore, Luke is in agreement, with the abomination, with Daniel, with the abomination of desolation, because the extreme part horizontally of the temple is the city. So
yeah, and
complex.
Yeah, and so it's one of and the Daniel prophecy was probably fulfilled in part, at least, in during the time of the Maccabees, Antiochus the Fourth, who basically offered an offering to Zeus on the altar in the temple to like intentionally desecrate it. But then Jesus applies it further to what's about to happen to Jerusalem. And it would be language, as you're pointing out, Michael, it would be language that was very familiar to Jewish people, right? It would be language that would I kind of liken it to, if when we hear 9/11, right?
Yeah.
It sort of gives you goosebumps, sort of gives you shivers to hear about something like that. And so I think it would be something along that line.
Many people, some people will argue, and I was reading this, a lot of people will argue and say, try to make the abomination, the desolation, the so-called Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, because he sets himself up in the temple. But the language is different.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, and the picture is different. Not exactly the same thing. So I don't accept that. Okay, that's a bunch of nonsense, twisting the text and everything, not wanting to study Matthew 24, not wanting to study Mark 13, not wanting to study Luke 21, and comparing them and seeing what the entire picture is being said.
Right. So Jesus tells them, if you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. If you're in the city, get out. The impulse would be, if you're in the country, outside the city, you see armies coming, what do you want to do? You want to go behind the walls, right? You want to go where there's walls and where there's safety. Jesus says, don't do that. don't make
Don't
that
go back in the city, you get trapped.
Don't go back in the city, flee. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. So what Jesus is doing is taking this this tack of prophets and they spoke against Jerusalem. They promised its judgment. They promised judgment against it. And for Jesus and for his view of things, their rejection of him is a sort of a death blow in that sense. How dreadful it will be is for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There'll be great distress in the land, wrath against this people. They'll fall by the sword and be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So, I mean, you get the direness of this, right? Now, you know, you can take this and you can, as unfortunately the church has done in the past, you can roll into all sorts of anti-Semitism and, you know, and talk about the rejection of the Jewish people. You know, you can go there, but that's not what we have here. What we have is this promise that Jerusalem is going to fall in judgment for largely for its continued rejection of God, specifically in Jesus. And there will be a time of the Gentiles, right? A time in which the Gentiles will trample on the city, he says. It's a powerful picture. Remember, the guys he's talking to are Jews. The guys he says, run to the mountains, are Jews. The ones who believe in him are Jewish people. That's not the issue. It's not a judgment against the Jewish people as much as a judgment against these leaders who have chosen to reject what God is doing. Verse 25 then, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nation will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. This is all prophetic language. This is all the kind of language that the prophets used often to talk about events that just rattle the world, right? That just rattle creation. And Jesus is using that same language. He says, people will faint from terror, apprehensive of what's coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they'll see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, and we'll go back and talk about these things, but I want you to notice 28. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. I just think that's really cool. You know, when all this stuff is happening, seems like the heavenly bodies are being shaken and everything's coming apart at the seams. You stand up and you lift up your heads. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to panic.
Sounds like he's talking about something different, though, than the destruction of Jerusalem.
So, starting in verse 25, things change a bit, don't they?
Yeah.
And this is where it gets difficult. This is where we struggle with Matthew, Mark, and Luke here. And this is where there's a lot of difference of opinion. But again, keep in mind the prophetic language. The prophetic language like that can refer to things like the besieging of a city, the destruction of a city. Those things in the prophets are often referred to in this very symbolic, graphic sounding language. So that's something to keep in mind.
Isaiah 13 is a probably good location to read. I mean, you go to Isaiah 13, you read verse 1, it says an oracle of Babylon. You keep reading, you'll start seeing this. The constellations are not going to give its light. The sun goes, the stars are going to fall, etc., etc. The king of Babylon shook the earth. I'm trying to say is you're going to see all this crazy language in there but it's still against Babylon. So my point being is that this is, as we said, this really some metaphoric language used among the prophets, not
it's
the
still
end of the world.
referencing Jerusalem and the destruction of the city. You get to the Son of Man coming in a cloud. Now we got some interesting stuff here, right? Son of Man coming in a cloud comes from what? Anybody know? Some of you do probably.
Daniel 7:13.
Daniel 7, right? Daniel 7 is this vision, this image, this vision of the Ancient of Days taking his judgment seat in heaven, and all the beastly kingdoms of the world are brought before him, and he strips them of their authority, and then comes one like a son of man, one who looks like a human being, and he gives all the glory and power of these kingdoms to this one who is coming. Well, Jesus identified with that son of man very, very, very much. And think about too, we were talking about the Romans coming and destroying the city of Jerusalem. We're talking about powers, kingdoms, right? We're talking about the conflict of nation versus nation. But Jesus is the one like a son of man. And so he is coming, is he coming to receive the power that God gives him? Is he coming in judgment? Probably the answer to that is yes. But these things get mashed together. The destruction of Jerusalem and the redemption of God's people, and that's the thing Jesus gets us to, right? What is happening? What is taking place? The events that are coming one after the other, as Jesus describes them, are going to end with the redemption of God's people.
That's right.
And that's I think where we need to get to for sure here. There's some really cool stuff with Old Testament language and references. I think Jesus as the Son of Man is really important because it speaks to the King of Kings, right? The one in whom all of the authority of in heaven and earth is finally invested.
Matthew's parallel in that document is closer to Daniel 7:13 than Mark and Luke.
It is.
So,
Yeah.
so you go, yeah, and then I'm agreeing with you. All these kingdoms are defeated, and one kingdom is established that will go on forever, and that's the kingdom of the Son of Man. And that's what he's saying. He also says it in Matthew 26:64 to the Sanhedrin. From now on, you will see me sitting at the right hand of God and sitting and coming on the clouds of heaven.
Yep.
So you can't do both. Sit at the right hand and come on the clouds. Okay.
Yeah. And so I think that's really important. And this kingdom that's coming, that Daniel talks about, the kingdom that is established, that crushes the others. And Daniel talks a lot about God's kingdom crushing the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus is just identifying with that and connecting himself to those events. But again, lift up your heads. Your redemption is drawing near. That's what happens when the regime changes and God's kingdom comes in its fullness. Redemption for his people. Redemption for the people who have put their faith in him.
In addition, there's some background information that I will mention really briefly. Rome goes through a civil war at this time, and it just blows up. Okay, these generals are fighting among one another. They call it the year of the four generals. And basically what happens is, what I read was one of the generals, Galba, he revolts against Nero. Shortly after that, Nero commits suicide in 68 AD, and then everybody wants the power, and all these generals are across the empire fighting, and there's famines, there's plagues, there's disruption. Vindex starts fighting with Otho, has Galba assassinated. Vindex starts fighting, and so does Vespasian. And like I said, it just erupts until Vespasian defeats everybody and takes control.
Yeah. Again, don't panic when you see the wars and rumors of wars. Don't panic. Don't be afraid. When this stuff gets as bad as it's going to get for you, I'm still with you. I'm still helping you. I'm still going to help you to testify to me and to stand firm and to gain life. Don't be afraid of losing this life that you have.
Uh,
He said,
as long as we're
yeah, go ahead.
as long as we're followers of Jesus, we won't suffer spiritual or eternal loss.
Yes, yes, I agree with that. And so, you know, when all this stuff starts to occur and the wars and the rumors of wars and the heavenly body's shaking and everything seems to be coming apart at the seams, you lift up your heads and you look forward to the coming of this kingdom that is never shaken. I like that in Hebrews. You're of a kingdom that is not shaken. And your redemption is drawing near. And then he tells them this parable, verse 29. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer's near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. I just think that's neat. We can look around us, we can see things happening, and we can be reminded, right, that the earth will be shaken and kingdoms will rise and fall and human beings will go through hardship and struggle from time to time, but the kingdom of God is near. So when you see these things happening, whatever they are, and however bad they may be, when you see them happening, you let them remind you of this kingdom that won't be shaken. The kingdom.
Christ reigns.
What's that?
Christ reigns.
Right, Jesus reigns, exactly. Now, verse 32. So I just skipped this verse if I could, but I can't. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Probably more ink has been spilled over that one verse than most other verses in the Bible. This generation will certainly not pass away. I'll tell you this. I think what he means is the fall of Jerusalem. In retrospect, it is hard to think he means anything else but the fall of Jerusalem.
The phrase "this generation" always refers to the generation of Jesus' time.
It
It
does.
doesn't
it does.
refer to any other generation.
People say things like, well, you know, no, he means the generation that will be living when Christ comes. Well, that's kind of a silly thing to say. I mean, of course, that generation is going to be around when Christ comes.
Peter warns
yeah.
warns the Jews in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, save yourselves from this corrupt generation. What else could it mean? That, you know, Jerusalem's going to fall and you're going to fall with it. Okay, even though he doesn't mention that in there, but that's only said to the Jews. There's also warning in Acts 13 to the Jews in Antioch, in Antioch, Pisidia, that because they're scoffing, that they will perish. Okay, what else could it be other than, you know, I have two commentaries to back me up on this one. Okay, that he sees that, you know, they both agreed that when Rome erupts, they're going to perish within that time.
Yeah, and it was, you know, within about 40 years of Jesus that
Get worked up.
that it occurred. But verse 33, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Yeah, this idea of heavens and earth being shaken.
That is the key. Okay, the previous verse was this generation. Then he goes into heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And now he's talking about the day that heaven and earth pass away.
So verse 434 then, be careful.
Me too.
For your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. By the way, that's not a comprehensive list of the things that might weigh you down, right? There are lots of things that may weigh your hearts down. Those are three of them. He says he doesn't want your heart weighed down with things that shouldn't be dragging you down. Be careful, or that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. For it'll come on all those who live on the face of the whole earth. Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that's about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. So what do you think that means? Verse 36, be always on the watch. How can we always be on the watch?
This seems to fit with other passages where he sort of saying, I'm warning you now so that you can get out and you can escape the extermination that the other people are going
Okay.
to.
We certainly saw that in this, right? Get out of the city while the army. So be on the watch that way. How else? How else do we need to be on the watch?
Spiritually fit.
Okay, what is that? What would you say that means?
That means to stay in the word
Okay,
and believe in the coming of Christ.
good, good. What are some other things that maybe help us to keep watch? He mentions one of them, right? Pray. Prayer is one of the ways that we keep watch.
He prays, watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation.
Uh-huh.
The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
I think we could explore that idea of watching, being alert, being awake, while so that we're not shocked by these things. We're not weighed down. The language that he uses sort of reminds us, I think, that spiritually speaking, a lot of human beings, maybe most human beings, there's a fatigue that can set in. You know, is that a way to say it? There is a spiritual fatigue that can set in. And where we just sort of little by little lose our interest in anything but what's the most urgent, the most, the thing that's pressing on us at the moment. And we can just lose track of our walk with the Lord and prayer and walking by the Spirit. And I don't mean that like God's going to give up on us when we do. I just mean that it can little by little just sort of erode our concern for the kingdom of God and our ability to kind of look ahead and keep our eyes over the horizon and wait for our redemption to come. Thoughts, comments?
I'll just toss in, as a lawyer,
Yeah.
one of the things that when I go around and talk to our different firms, we're always concerned because we get a lot of malpractice cases arising out of missed deadlines. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good. Yeah.
And a simple message that we are trying to get across is don't wait till the last day. Just don't do it.
Yeah.
Just do it at least the day before it's due.
Right.
And it would be, I mean, our rough estimates are we could avoid about half of the missed deadlines.
Wow.
If people would just do things the day before they thought the deadline. Because then if there's a glitch or if they miscalculated or this stuff, most of the time it's less than 24 hours. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. This is a really hard message to get across because lawyers are trained to work to deadlines. Mm-hmm. And many of us are trained to work to deadlines. And this is very clever of not unexpectedly, of Jesus and God. There's no deadline. I mean, I think, look, if I were having to explain this, I mean, that would be the basic point. You can't put it off, right? You can't put off your concern about your sin. You can't put off you can't just say, well, I'm going to deal with that down the road. All of that, you need to be, I mean, I think people dislike it, but you're always under pressure in Christianity that the next minute could be it. Right? Because a deadline provides security as well as pressure, right? And we don't have a deadline in that respect. I don't know that watching, active watching is what he's talking about here. I think it's the readiness and
Yeah.
being aware of the possibility.
Yeah.
Right. So you're at least alert, not entirely focused, but it's in your frame of reference. And I think for good or bad, for most Christians, I think it probably is at least a recurring thing that we think about. And prayer, certainly even the Lord's Prayer suggests some references to, evokes some of those ideas of thy kingdom come. Well, like, when is that going to happen? And lead me not into temptation, right? Because we have anyway, I think I've made the point. So
Really good points. I think you're right. And I think that alertness to the possibility and the imminent coming of the kingdom. It's always imminent, right? It's always right around the corner. It's always near. And I think that's a healthy attitude for Christians. I think it can be used in unhealthy ways. It can cause us to have a disregard for the things around us sometimes. But I don't think it necessarily has to. And I think the importance of it is clear. That we got to be people who are aware of that thing, because you don't want it to close on you like a trap. And if nothing else, if Jesus doesn't come back before I die, one of these days I'm going to die, and I don't know when that is, right? That's going to close on me like a trap if Jesus doesn't come back. The time is going to close, and I need to be ready for that, and I need to be aware of that, and know that this life isn't all there is. I remember when I was in college, I was in a Wednesday night Bible study. I went to this Jim Woodruff's house. Jim was a professor there. We'd go to his house for this Bible study. And I still remember him vividly talking about this one day. And he said, he was in his 60s then, probably. And he said, I remember him saying, looking around at us and going, none of you are thinking about that. You're thinking about finals, and you're thinking about getting married, and you're thinking about your career, you're thinking about, and I just thought that was a really insightful thing that he said, that, none of you are thinking about that. We probably weren't very much. But we ought to be, and we ought to keep, not morbidly, not with this sort of weird fascination for numbers and predictions and all that stuff. That's not the point. But this alertness to the imminence of God's kingdom, the coming of God's kingdom, and the redemption that's supposed to mean for us.
In Matthew's account, after verse 35, he says, "But in that day, no one knows the day or the hour." You're not going to know when. We do not know when Christ is going to return. It's been repeated over and over that we do not know. That was discussed a few chapters ago in Luke. Okay, we're not going to know. So essentially, yes, keep watch, stay alert.
And we've been trying to predict it, or some of us have been trying to predict it for centuries, right? And claiming that it's coming, and claiming sometimes with years, and I kind of joke about it, but that winds up being devastating. Some religious leader somewhere says Jesus is coming back in 1846, and and they all go and assemble and get ready for him to come, and he didn't show up. And it can be devastating. It really can. It can be devastating to faith. It can be devastating to this attitude of awareness and alertness.
With everything that the Bible says about that, why do you think people do it?
Because we're stubborn.
It makes no sense, the
And
Bible.
we're fascinated with such things, yeah, yeah, I know.
We won't know, but yet people persist in doing that.
Yeah.
Well, people do it because, as I said, there's comfort in a deadline.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, it gives you some degree of security, and I guess we may not get there, but it is in the next discussion, it is the wicked servant who says, my master is staying away a long time, right? So we want that certainty. It's just very human, and as I said, in my job, I see this all the time, right? We prioritize, we sort everything out by when something is due or when something's happened. And so I think people just naturally want to figure this out. I actually think that the more interesting question, if you're going down that path, is why are you so focused on this? And that might tell you something in and of itself as to why is this so important to you, as opposed to I'm just going to be ready. But it's human. It's very human. And God knows that, right? We have all of this stuff about it. I mean, Jesus didn't just, in Luke, it's not just this one. He's going to tell several stories, right, to illustrate this thing. So.
absolutely.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Did someone want to say something or?
Yeah, well, even some Christians today, when I was still part of First Free, some of the guys were mentioning in the Bible study group, it's like some people here are already like, well, they don't believe that Jesus is coming back. And I'm like, Jesus is coming back, not to look at the culture and say, well, there's peacetime and there's not much going on, turmoil in the world. That doesn't mean that Jesus isn't going to return and that things are okay. We'll have pockets of peace and pockets of craziness.
And that can be the other side of this, that we can sort of lose focus on that. And I think some aspects of Christianity have, in fact, lost sight of the second coming and that expectation and anticipation and watchfulness that we're supposed to have. But anyway, what that's worth.
One brief comment. I didn't mention, it didn't get mentioned, but it's mentioned in Matthew about when he comes on the clouds, that the tribes of the land, many translations translate that people of the earth. That's not a correct translation. It's out of man, Zechariah chapter 12. I've wrote a paper on it. I've studied the words. Okay. And that the angels go to collect people. That's messengers. And yet, the angels do not collect people. The proper, Jesus explains in the parable that the angels gather the wicked and throw them into the furnace. Okay, they have them burned up, but there's no reference to angels gathering the elect. So we understand that even though the Jerusalem is destroyed, the gospel will still continue on and being proclaimed. That's what Matthew.
One of the things I wanted to point out that when he talks about how you'll be thrown in prison and you'll be brought before kings and rulers and testify to me. Remember, Luke wrote Acts, and so when in Acts you see these very things happening, I think we're supposed to make those connections. That what Jesus was talking about was exactly what happened to Paul and to Peter and to John and to James and what has happened to Christians, for 2,000 years since. So yeah. Well, I've got 8:30, so we will leave it there. Ron, are you here next week?
I am.
Okay.